We have to start, of course, with the war in Ukraine and the very latest that we can glean, which is happening on the ground. Let's go ahead and put this first tweet up on the screen. More escalating rhetoric here from Putin. He says that Ukraine could lose its statehood. The whole tweet says Russia's dictator Vladimir Putin said that if Ukraine, quote, continues to behave in the same way, that will bring into question the future of its statehood. That during a meeting broadcast on TV, there were some additional eyebrow-raising comments that we'll get to later as well from Putin about, who he considers to be combatants that are sanctions, or he considers to be an act of war. So a lot of escalating rhetoric there. One of the worrying situations that we were tracking over the weekend is that there was fighting very close to a large nuclear plant. Let's go ahead and put this tear sheet up on the screen. Thankfully, things did not go completely sideways here. There was no nuclear meltdown, but the basic idea is that Russia is trying to take control of these power plants, especially the nuclear power plants, because this is how much of Ukraine gets their energy, so that they can have control over the electric grid.
Exactly.
There were fires nearby that had people extremely concerned. Turns out the fires and the shelling was of a building on the site, but not actually the nuclear reactor. Now you have this very strange situation where the power plant is actually still being run by Ukrainians, but the Russians are in charge. This is similar to the dynamic that we saw already at Chernobyl.
Yeah, I want to be clear here. This is an outrageous act. Beyond also just the civilian targets, Russia is supposed to be a responsible nuclear power. Attacking a nuclear power plant is an explicit violation of the IAEA, of which Russia loves to talk about, especially whenever it comes to the Iranian nuclear deal, something which we would love to see in terms of compliance. And this is the issue, which is that by attacking this plant, they were trying to take out 25% of the power that the entire country gets from this power plant. And they are risking a serious escalation here in terms of what that means. Already, IAEA inspectors and others had said that the Russians have not allowed them in order to have any communication or have any inspection of the plant. And this is outrageously dangerous. Now, look, I just did a whole monologue on how nuclear power is safe, effective, and all that. And all of that remains true. But attacking a nuclear reactor with shelling and weapons seems bad. I'll go ahead and just say that for the record. It just goes to show you the tactics that they're willing to use.
That's right. And how dangerous this really was. Because even if, the intent was just to take control of the plant, and we're just going to show, to the side of the nuclear reactor, this other building that's on the site, obviously you're creating an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and not just for the Ukrainian population, but for their own population as well, and for the entire region. So that was something that people were watching with a lot of obvious concern. And it was crazy too, because there was actually a live stream, did you see this, of some of the fighting while it was going on, and you had tens of thousands of people watching some of the fighting unfold in real time. Big picture, let's go ahead and put the battle map that we have up on the screen from SimTac. This is the same map we've been showing you over days. There really hasn't been a whole lot of movement in terms of Russian advances. In fact, they've been trying to make their way to Odessa, a key strategic port city on the Black Sea. They have been, at the very least, held back, and there are some reports that they have actually been pushed further back from their positions in one of the cities that is en route there between Mariupol and Odessa. At the same time, the situation in Mariupol is really quite dire. Those are the reports from the ground. Of course, that city has undergone quite a lot of shelling. It also is under siege, and so they don't have heat, they don't have electricity, they don't have water. It is still very, very cold in Ukraine this time of year. So civilians there are really suffering. And let's put this next piece up on the screen. Very murky, to be honest with you, what happened here. So Ukrainian officials are saying that we do know there was a ceasefire that was agreed to, a temporary ceasefire, in order to establish humanitarian corridors to try to allow civilians from Mariupol in order to evacuate. That ceasefire quickly collapsed. Ukrainian officials are saying that Russians were shelling civilians, creating a very dangerous situation there. Russians are saying that Ukrainians were using people as human shields. And I do want to say, late yesterday, and not in time to be able to pull the element, but even our own defense officials are saying they were unable to corroborate the claims from the Ukrainians that Russians were violating the ceasefire. So very murky exactly what happened to cause that temporary ceasefire to collapse and allow civilians to evacuate. But we do know that they were unable to establish those humanitarian corridors and be able to get people out. At the same time, the UN Human Rights Office is saying that at least 351 civilians have been confirmed killed in the conflict. It is likely more than that. That's just the numbers that they are able to count right now.
Yeah, it's very likely. And look, I mean, we have no idea about that humanitarian corridor. The fog of war makes it so that it's very difficult to discern. I watched a lot of this happen in Syria, and I can tell you that there was a lot of blame to go around on many sides. And unfortunately, there's a lot of currency to be made, both in terms of the other person violated it, and oftentimes they can be used for military advantage. All we know is that it's hell on earth for the people who are actually involved. So let's go ahead and put this video up on the screen. I'll talk a little bit over it. But this just shows you this is what a supposed humanitarian corridor is supposed to look like during the evacuation. This was in the city of Arpin. Now, this comes from an account claiming that it was Russians shelling. Again, we do not know exactly what it was. All we can say is that's a beautiful city that is now on fire in the middle of what's supposed to be a humanitarian evacuation. And that's just the civilians that are always who are the number one people we should really be thinking about here in this conflict. We did have some breaking news, Krystal, this morning. Gone ahead and verified it from the Kremlin spokesperson. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. It's breaking literally as we're doing the show, which is that Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, says 3 demands for which Russia will, quote, stop its military action in a moment is what he says if Ukraine meets these demands. So let's go ahead. Quote, Russia told Ukraine it could halt the operation, quote, at any moment if Kiev meets Russian conditions. Ukraine must recognize Crimea as Russian, as well as the independence of the DNR and the LNR, the Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republics, which are there in the eastern separatist regions. That was one of the pretexts for why this operation started in the first place. Finally, it says that Ukraine must amend its constitution and renounce its claim to join any bloc, in a reference to both the European Union and the NATO alliance. Now, the one thing I do want to be clear here is that it's unclear currently whether the quote-unquote demilitarization aspect remains on the table. So there is a report from the largest Eastern media company that before issuing this demand, Krystal, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, had already said that Russia will complete demilitarization of Ukraine. So the first two, I think you and I could probably see some sort of deal on that happening. Amending the Constitution saying, look, we're not going to join the EU, we're not going to join NATO as long as you guys go ahead and pull out. Sure, even Crimea and, the DNR and the there's some quibbles to be had on where exactly the front line and all of that might happen. But the demilitarization aspect, especially after literally getting invaded as a country, it's not going to happen.
That's a non-starter.
I just want to say this, and this was a report out there, that this is from Christo Gravzes. He says that 2 persons close to the Ukraine-Russia negotiations tell him that Russia proposed that Zelensky could remain the pro forma president, but that Russia would get to choose who the prime minister was. So they're also indicating behind the scenes that they're like, okay, you might be able to say, but you would have no power, but we would really run the show. And that pairs with the thing that we first put up there that Putin said that Ukraine could, quote, lose its statehood. So the demands in English that are being put out seem relatively reasonable. Behind the scenes, there are still some demands which could be complete non-starters for this conflict.
Yeah, and that's what's really important, because if it was just, this may sound horrible, but the reality is where things stand today. If it was, hey, we're going to give you Crimea, which was effectively already done. It literally was. We're going to give you the separatist republics and we'll figure out the lines and we're going to agree and put it in the Constitution. We're not joining any bloc. You take that deal all day long. Mm-hmm. That's a best. If
they actually leave, too.
Absolutely, 100%. If that's really an actual deal on the table. But when you start to talk about demilitarization after your entire nation has just been invaded by your next door neighbor, that's a total non-starter. And then also, I mean, think of what an ideal situation, that political dynamic you laid out would be for Russia, where you keep Zelensky as the technical figurehead, lending the government some air of legitimacy among Westerners who now love this guy, when really it's just a puppet government of the Kremlin. So that would be, of course, an ideal political situation for them. And I have to think for Zelensky and the Ukrainians, that is also a non-starter. But, you know, this continues to be an extremely dangerous situation in terms of a broader escalation. And there was news that came out yesterday about just how many weapons we have been flowing into this country. I mean, it is beyond what you could possibly—
This is Syria 2.0, Krystal.
Comprehend. Yeah. They're calling it Berlin Airlift 2.0. This was reporting from the New York Times. So just for comparison, there was a $60 million arms package to Ukraine that was announced back in August. And that was not fulfilled until November. But now, the president approved $350 million in military aid on February 26th. So that's nearly 6 times larger. And 70% of it was delivered in 5 days. So they are rushing in everything they possibly can. The US and NATO, in less than a week, have pushed more than 17,000 anti-tank weapons, including Javelin missiles, over the borders of Poland and Romania into Ukraine. They also detail a lot of technical support that we are directly providing to Zelensky to help keep him alive, but also to their military forces to help them, you know, using our own intelligence and satellite capabilities to figure out where the Russians are and what their plans are. And they are coming very close to the line of being considered a co-combatant in this conflict. And one of the things that they lay out here is that, look, by our definition, we haven't crossed the line, but the Russians have a different definition. I mean, from their perspective, they've already said that even just our sanctions are an act of war. So you are really playing with fire here when you are getting so directly involved. There was also, and Secretary Blinken spoke to us trying to work out a deal with Poland so that we could, in fact, get the Ukrainians these fighter jets. The idea is basically Poland has the type of, you know, Soviet fighter jets that the Ukrainians know how to fly. So the idea is Poland would give them those, and we would replace the Polish fleet with our own jet fighters. So we're not directly putting them in, but we're basically facilitating the transfer. Again, listen, guys, at this point, even though the Ukrainians have, you know, held the Russian forces back way better than anyone anticipated, partly I think this helps reveal part of how they've been able to do this is with overwhelming sort of like military capabilities given by the US and NATO and also by our technical support. But you know, we have to be focused on keeping this conflict to Ukraine and not escalating it any further. And when you're taking these types of actions that Russia could easily view as escalatory and the US becoming directly engaged in this war, you are really playing a dangerous game here.
That's my great fear. That's why I referenced Syria. I mean, whenever you think about Syria, remember it started off as an actual conflict of Syrians and the Qataris and the Saudis and the Americans and the Libyans and the Russians, and everybody starts getting involved. And 5 years in, you have rebel groups, right, which are armed to the teeth in terms of their military technology, and which necessitates then also, whenever the political objective of the Assad regime and the Putin government for keeping Assad in power was total annihilation of those civilian populations. And everybody suffered. That's part of the reason the death toll was so high and the tactics were so brutal. I'm sorry, but I do think that that is just the most likely scenario here. Given the demands here and given the tactics of the Russian military, we saw that they were able to do it in Aleppo, and we also saw them do it in their own country, in Grozny, in the Chechnyan civil war. Almost certainly, this seems to be an outright play-by-play of what happened in Chechnya. At this point, the Russian government just simply has gotten too much invested in order to pull out, just like they did there, from a political objective and from Putin saving face. And that means a full bore and, use of some of the most brutal military tactics that the world has seen in a long time, especially on a stage like this. And, with the U.S., providing ISR capability, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to the Ukrainian military, it will prolong the conflict as well. I'm just, I'm not saying a moral judgment. It's just a fact. It is going to do so. And a lot of people are going to lose their lives here. And I really think that we are on the precipice of something way worse than what we've already seen. The history of warfare, and just particularly of the main actor in this, Russian military, shows us what is actually possible.
A lot of analysts are basically have the expectation that this is going to be a long, grinding conflict that, eventually the Russians, with their military superiority and their larger amount of resources brought to bear. There's also reports that they're actually recruiting Syrian fighters who are knowledgeable in urban warfare to help them take the city of Kyiv, that eventually they will be able to take over the regions that they want to, and specifically the capital city of Kyiv. And so you'll have this long-going conflict with a guerrilla insurgency, much like what they faced again in Afghanistan. And we also have the lesson of history of what happened when we armed that resistance to the teeth. And, I don't see a lot of hand-wringing about who and how we are arming the Ukrainians right now. And, it is very well documented that a part of their National Guard are avowed neo-Nazis, especially actually down in that Black Sea region around Mariupol. That's where the Azov battalion is based and is strongest. So, there's a lot of worrying developments here. And in particular, for us walking right up to that line of being drawn into this conflict, there's also reports we may be sort of bolstering the Ukrainian cyber capabilities.
Yeah, almost certainly.
Because they haven't faced the level of cyber attacks that were expected. So if you're watching from the outside, you're thinking maybe the U.S. is helping to harden their tech to make sure that they are not so vulnerable to cyber attacks. There's also speculation that we may be intermittently disrupting Russian communication. So that's pretty direct involvement.
Yes.
So again, this is a very, very dangerous posture for the U.S. to be taking. And even though the Biden administration has been very clear about no boots on the ground, if Russia views us as a party to this conflict and strikes some of our facilities, kills any of our people, the way that we could get brought in, do you think that people wouldn't flip on a dime if there was that kind of provocation? Yeah. Of course they would.
What you're outlining is why we need great care whenever we consider this. There's a big difference between Javelin anti-tank missiles and then using the U.S. military to disrupt Russian communications, right? Yeah. One is an act of actual, cyber war.
Yeah.
The second one is on these Polish jets. I'm sorry, I do not think that a small handful of former Russian jets that the Poles have is going to make a significant difference in the air war over Ukraine. And that is a direct facilitation by a NATO ally of something which is just constitutionally different. In terms of its makeup in jets versus missiles and planes. It may sound foolish, but whenever you have planes like that that kill Russian soldiers or shoot down Russian planes, it is a level of escalation in the level of aid. And it's all also in the eye of the beholder. What do they consider to be a matter of escalation? Right now in rhetoric that they are saying, anybody who facilitates these types of things itself is considered a co-combatant. They can say that. Are they going to do anything about that? Obviously, those are two different things. So we need to take great care in the level of aid that we do go ahead and give, and also to make sure it doesn't come back to bite us in the future. Yeah. And we have to take great care and also not feeding what the Russian narrative is in terms of funding groups which they say that this is all about in the first place. So this is all in the interest of, we want peace and we want less loss of life. And in the past, it shows us that being lacking in consideration can make the conflict actually go much, much longer.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.